Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from all participants, including the panelists and the audience who are joining us from various parts of the world. Thank you for joining with us today. Thank you to all the co-hosts of this event, the Canadian Tamil Congress, the Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice, the Department of Center for Human Rights and Global Justice, New York School of Law, New York University. Thank you to all the distinguished panelists, especially the ones who have joined from Sri Lanka, who might be at some kind of risk of intimidation. Thank you to all the distinguished international experts who have had previous relationship with Sri Lanka in their capacity of different offices. Without further delay, may I hand you over to our moderator, Melissa, who is the campaign director of Sri Lanka Campaign for Peace and Justice, who are one of the co-hosts. Take it away, Melissa.
Thank you, Soren, and thank you to Global Tamil Forum, the Canadian Tamil Congress, and the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University, who are our co-sponsors for this event. And thank you to all of you in the audience who are joining us today for this very important event to discuss human rights and transitional justice in Sri Lanka. This is a critical time for these issues. As the High Commissioner for Human Rights has flagged in her recent report, there are early warning signs and heightened risk of future violations within Sri Lanka, enabled by impunity and the undermining of the rule of law and democratic rights. But you're not here to hear from me, you're here to hear from our panelists. We have 2 hours for this event today. First, we will have presentations from each of our panelists, and then we will open into a panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session, taking questions from you, our audience. If you have questions for our panelists today, please email them to info@canadiantamilcongress.ca. You should see the email address on the screen and in the comments on the section. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to our first presenter. Charles Petrie is a former UN Assistant Secretary General with close to 30 years experience working in contexts of conflict and famine. And he resigned from the United Nations in part as a result of his inability to get the organization to investigate one of its own who had participated in the crime of genocide. In March 2012, Charles Petrie was designated by the UN Secretary General to lead an internal review of the UN's actions in Sri Lanka during the last phase of the conflict. The report was submitted to the Secretary General in early November of that year and served as a basis for the elaboration of the Secretary General's Rights Up Front policy, a policy that places protection at the forefront of all UN action. Charles Petrie continues to be involved in Myanmar, serving as an advisor to the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Charles is going to speak to us today about the UN and its commitment to human rights in Sri Lanka. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Melissa. Sorry, just 1 minute, trying to get everything together. Yeah, so thank you. So democracy and rule of law have entered dangerous, uncharted waters in Sri Lanka. Since its independence, Sri Lanka has experienced 3 waves of violence, but the country has never dealt with its past. Communities have never been given an opportunity to come to terms with their suffering, and those responsible have, with very few exceptions, been held to account. When in 2015, Sri Lanka co-sponsored and signed the UN Human Rights Council resolution, there was a moment of hope that the newly elected government would not only support international transitional justice efforts, but would even attempt to put in place similar local mechanisms. But this optimism was short-lived, in part because of the government's non-implementation of what had been initially promised, but more importantly, following the election in 2020 of a government believing it had received a clear populist Sinhalese Buddhist mandate encouraging it in its exclusionary policies. There are well-founded fears that Sri Lanka's democratic system is now under threat. Sri Lanka today faces a dangerous mix of political and social forces, the spread of COVID and the fear and suspicion it brings, a deteriorating economy crippled by COVID and debt, and heading towards sovereign default or a painful international bailout. The authoritarian concentration of power in the presidency, aided by rapid militarization of civil administration, and the active cultivation of anti-minority sentiments, particularly against the Muslims. Together, these have begun to produce anger and instability, to which traditionally the state has never hesitated to respond with violence and repression. The country has begun to travel down a dangerous path that could spark instability that would bring Sri Lanka and its international partners much greater difficulties later on. Sri Lanka's problems can't be solved by the UN or other outside powers. The drive and commitment to come to terms with a painful past and to address the dangerous divisions and tensions of today need to come from within the country, and an enlightened leadership must show the direction. Such leadership seems to currently be lacking. Once more, Sri Lanka presents the question of the seriousness and effectiveness of the UN's commitment to fulfilling its human rights mandate. As was already mentioned, I led the internal investigation of the UN's performance at the end of the Sri Lankan civil war. The review highlighted the systemic nature of the organization's inability to fully assume its protection responsibilities. The Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, accepted the damning conclusions of the report and introduced a policy that placed human rights and protection at the forefront of UN action. But the policy, as it was articulated then, did not survive the transition into the new Secretary General's tenure. It was in part defeated by the emergence of a Darwinian type of New World Order, with various forms of nationalism taking on more central roles in defining international relations. But the issue remained on the Secretary General's agenda. In early 2019, the Secretary General commissioned a confidential review of how to strengthen the organizational culture in support of human rights. The review found that there continued to be a lack of commitment by senior leadership to addressing human rights concerns. The review concluded that there was an urgent need for clear internal communication on the importance of safeguarding UN values and upholding human rights. That there was a need to provide better incentive structures for strong leadership, which included accountability for inaction on human rights. And finally, the need to equip staff with the required knowledge and skills to champion human rights across the organization. In line with the aforementioned stated intentions, another significant contribution to the UN's commitment to try to operate in complex situations has come out of the Secretary General's 2017 reform agenda. The reform has three components to it: peace and security, development, and management. The development component of the reform agenda entailed detaching the resident coordinator position from its agency responsibility, in this case UNDP, and linking the position directly to the Deputy Secretary General, and tasking the mandate of the position to the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. The freeing of the UN in-country representative from any agency responsibility and linking the position directly to the Deputy Secretary General through the newly created Development Coordination Office, in theory, increases the capacity of the position to convene and coordinate a UN system-wide response, which would include now the Bretton Woods institutions. Basing the RC's mandate on the accomplishments of the SDGs should also help to depoliticize the position, while still retaining its ability to address questions of governance and protection. And so it is almost undeniable that today there is a greater awareness in the UN of the importance of its protection responsibilities. Over the last year, high-level meetings on Sri Lanka, some even chaired by the UN Secretary General, have underscored the UN's commitment to its protection mandate. Understandings have been reached on the importance of calibrating messaging from in-country and headquarters structures in New York and Geneva that assert the basic UN principles. Critical importance has been given to developing a comprehensive UN strategy that would allow for engagement with the government, provide services to the people, and firmly assert UN principles relating to human rights, social cohesion, non-discrimination, and transitional justice. Unfortunately, these good intentions have yet to result in concrete action. The ability and willingness of the UN to promote a coherent approach towards fulfilling its mandates as ascribed to it by its charter is frustrated by internal rivalries and the lack of an overall commitment to ensure system-wide compliance. The UN today as an entity continues to be dysfunctional in its approach to dealing with the emergence of serious human rights abuses and threats. It's not a question of the UN not having the tools and mechanisms to do so, but rather lacking the will and courage to use them effectively. Sri Lanka's challenges today are fundamentally political and human rights in nature. The UN's relevance in Sri Lanka has to be directly linked to the upholding of its founding principles as articulated in its charter, a charter to which all of the General Assembly member states have subscribed. This means that the UN leadership must find the courage to prioritize principled approaches over political calculations and programmatic engagement. To have a meaningful impact in Sri Lanka, the whole of the UN system needs to work in step as one to promote its values. Will it do so? Only time and history will tell. In the immediate though, I would urge those in greatest need not to count on the UN being able to live up to its responsibility towards we the people. Not counting on the organization to live up to the UN Charter, of which we the people is the preamble, will avoid major disappointments and unnecessary suffering. But were I to be proven wrong, then the world will have become a much better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Charles. And our next speaker is Pablo de Grief, who is currently Senior Fellow and Director of the Transitional Justice Program at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the School of Law at NYU. Prior to joining NYU, he was the Director of Research at the International Center for Transitional Justice from 2001 to 2014. In 2011, the UN Human Rights Council established a mandate for a special rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And at the 19th session, HRC session on 23rd March 2012, de Grief was appointed to the post. As Special Rapporteur, de Grief has visited Sri Lanka at least 4 times during 2015 to 2019. He has also provided advice to a wide range of governments, the UN and non-governmental organizations, particularly victims organizations, truth commissions, and multilateral institutions in the area of transitional justice, gender issues, and the linkages between justice, security, and development. And Pablo will speak to us today about monitoring international action on accountability. Pablo. Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Melissa. And I have to say it's an honor for the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU, of which I am a member, to co-host this event. And it is particularly an honor to share the event with both the Sri Lankan experts and the international experts. I also have to express at the outset my agreement with the very compelling intervention that Charles just made. And also to say that in that respect, it's a hard act to follow. I would like to make some general interventions in the brief time that I have. We are here in part because of the continuation of a long history on the part of Sri Lanka of what a very good scholar has called quasi-compliance with obligations. And of course, I want to clarify that quasi-compliance is not a kind of compliance, but a kind of non-compliance. I also want to say that the relevant obligations that we are talking about here, although often called international obligations, It is important to think that international law doesn't hover mysteriously above nation states, but that it is actually the reflection of commitments voluntarily undertaken by the states that form the international community, and that as a consequence give shape to those international obligations. Sri Lanka is a signatory to all the major human rights instruments. As Charles mentioned, it is, of course, a part of the General Assembly, and as such, accepts the obligations contained in the Charter of the United Nations. But the crucial point is that ultimately these are obligations that Sri Lanka has, not just to the international community, but primarily to its own citizens. So the history of non-compliance with obligations, it's a history that should not be thought of primarily as a history of failure to the international community, but as a history of failure to Sri Lankans' own citizens. And to delve into a few of the details of that history, it is a history that, of course, includes both intra as well as intercommunity violence. And it is a history that, as Charles also mentioned, includes periodic cycles of violence. And therefore, I think that it is a huge mistake to reduce the transitional justice and the accountability project and the human rights project more broadly, as if it concerned only one period in Sri Lanka's history, namely the period around the end of the conflict around 2009. The Accountability Project, the Transitional Justice Project, and more broadly, the Human Rights Project is one that should be used in order to analyze the long history of Sri Lanka that includes these periodic cycles of violence that we have mentioned. And those cycles of violence, in a certain sense, are now very well understood, not just regarding Sri Lanka, but globally. There is a very robust correlation between unredressed human rights violations and the occurrence of violence in the future. So, though social science is not a predictive, exact predictive science such as physics, we now know enough to understand what are the factors that greatly increase the probability of violence and violations in the future. And this is why we are so concerned about the state of Sri Lanka today. The problem with the transitional project, the accountability project, and more broadly, the human rights project in Sri Lanka, in my experience during the visits that I made in the period following 2015, was that it wasn't taken sufficiently seriously by crucial sectors of Sri Lankan society. It was taken quite seriously by some sectors of civil society, and for instance, the work of the consultation task force, now almost willfully forgotten by the current government and by sectors, including of the previous government. I think is an example of progress that Sri Lanka made during that period. There was also progress in some sectors of the previous government, for example, as expressed in the creation and the work of the Secretariat for the Coordination of Reconciliation Mechanisms, now disbanded and the tasks left abandoned. But the problem is that despite those signs of progress, the project overall had no big sponsors. It would have required very strong leadership on the part of the president, the prime minister, and high government officials. But it would also have required some clearer perceptions of generalized interests on the part of civil society. So there was much that could have been done, both institutionally and in terms of civil society, to give life to that project, which, if it had been done, we would not have the concerns that we have today. I mentioned in the report that was eventually presented to the Council some of the crucial elements that could have prevented us from getting to where we are today, and that would prevent us from the apprehension about where all of these might lead to. Strengthening the independence of the judiciary, a judiciary that is occasionally capable of taking courageous and important decisions, such as the decision of the Supreme Court in December 2018, declaring the unconstitutionality of the dissolution of parliament at the time. But institutionally speaking, the independence of the judiciary needs to be strengthened. It would have required increasing the investigatory capacity and, in my opinion, importantly, reforms of the Office of the Attorney General, which combines advocacy of the state and the functions of a public prosecutor. And that creates a very clear conflict of interest for the office, when those that are to be investigated and prosecutors are precisely state agencies. And it would have required finishing the overall reliance on ad hoc commissions, which have clearly not produced the level of confidence in institutions that was expected at one point from them. It would have required establishing a real and serious truth commission. On the part of civil society, again, it would also have required greater intercommunal cooperation in order to, among other things, press for the reforms that I just mentioned, and for other reforms that were crucial for Sri Lanka's future, including strengthening the civilian oversight over the security services. But now this is where we are. And I think that with Charles, while I think that there are very important initiatives proposed in the High Commissioner's latest report, and that all of them should be considered, including universal jurisdiction cases, probably the creation of a country-specific mandate. But however, I think with Charles that ultimately the fate of Sri Lanka is going to depend on Sri Lankans' initiatives. And in ceasing to understand the Human Rights Project as a zero-sum game, as if it were simply of interest to one community, seizing rather the opportunity to use the integrative potential of the human rights language in order to, among other things, further a development project which should not be considered simply in terms of economic development, but for the first time of the security of the rights of all Sri Lankans. And I will stop here, but I will be very happy to discuss later on, and moreover to listen to my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo. And now we're going to hear from a few of our Sri Lankan panelists. And first up is Bhavani Fonseca, who is a senior researcher at the Centre for Policy Alternatives, an attorney at law in Sri Lanka, an author and activist. Bhavani.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the organizers for organizing this very timely discussion. I have 5 minutes to talk about democratic space and the rule of law, and so I'm going to keep my comments very brief, but hopefully we have time during the next session to go a bit deeper into it. We are having this conversation during the lead up to the Human Rights Council, and it's very important at this time to also reflect while we look at the High Commissioner's report and the comments made by the previous 2 speakers as to what the real context is on the ground. And also to factor in, and this is very important, that we are globally in a context, in a pandemic, unprecedented challenges. And it is in this context that we will also see measures being taken to address the growing and multi-pronged challenges at play. So in Sri Lanka, we have seen in the last 15 months, really from the election of the president in November 2019, and really in 2020, a pandemic, very worrying signs in terms of democratic backsliding and the erosion of the rule of law. Now, as I said, the pandemic will bring in various measures. And what we have seen in Sri Lanka are the measures that are concerning in terms of legality, proportionality, and non-discrimination. And I'll try to address some of these issues as well as raising them later on. But in 2020 alone, what we have seen is a very strong executive presidency coming about. We've seen militarized governance, and in this I say former and serving military officials playing a dominant role in the pandemic, but also in governance of key civilian positions being taken by these individuals. We have seen during 2020 the lockdown, but also very concerning, for 5 months we did not have a parliament, a functioning parliament. So what that meant was there was no oversight, there was no effective check and balance, and contrasting this was a very powerful executive rule that was emerging in Sri Lanka. In contrast, also, we had at the same time various measures being brought in to curtail civilian civic liberties, fundamental freedoms. So we had restrictions of movement, on expression, we saw a spate of high-profile arrest detentions happening, and these are of very serious concern. But this also goes to the whole question that we had measures being introduced that were extra-legal, extremely broad, and vague. So there was a real concern as to what was going on and the legality of these questions. And at the same time, this was all in 2020, we also saw a spate of task forces being appointed, task forces that had a range of functions, mainly to address what was happening with the pandemic. But in June, we also saw other task forces appointed, and this has a long-term implication. So we have government with a very strong executive, but also governance in terms of task forces and a militarized approach. In 2020, we also saw a very key constitutional amendment being passed, the 20th Amendment, go into the details, but in a nutshell, it really strengthened and consolidated the executive rule and removed the checks and balances. So what started in terms of the COVID response was seen with the constitutional amendment was really the erosion of the rule of law, concerns with the separation of powers. So, I mean, those are very, very worrying trends we are facing in Sri Lanka. Added to this is the whole issue of targeting individuals holiness, the space for dissent is fast shrinking. So we've seen a steady attack on processes, systems that were investigating, prosecuting violations, corruption, and now we've seen a heightened sense of political victimization. So the trend is that the democratic space is fast shrinking in terms of governance and government, but also in terms of targeting those who've been involved in terms of accountability, in terms of good government. And finally, I've been told I only have 1 minute, is this entrenched culture of impunity, and I hope my colleagues speak to this, there's no hope for justice in Sri Lanka. And countering this is the high surveillance. So this is a very extremely dangerous situation. And I want to end with this comment the High Commissioner makes in her report. Sri Lanka is at a critical turning point. And there's no way of further amplifying this, but to say that this is the moment to take note and to act on this. So I will end here, and hopefully we have time to go into more detail in terms of some of the issues raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavani, for that. And next we have Amir Faiz, who is a lawyer, Director of International Affairs at the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress, writer, and a human rights activist. And Amir will speak to us about the challenges faced by the Muslim community in Sri Lanka. Faiz.
Thank you. Greetings from Colombo to everyone. As Melissa said, I'm expected to talk about the challenges faced by the Muslim communities. And as Bhavani said, it will be limited within 5 minutes. Let me try to be brief as possible. The systemic discrimination and structural violence against numerically smaller communities have been there. But since the end of the war in 2019, targeting religious minorities such as evangelical Christians and Muslims grew. And from about 2012, the violence against Muslims intensified. In 2014, 15, 18, Muslim places of worship, businesses, houses were attacked in several places. Using the Easter Sunday terrorist attack of April 2019, in May 2019, the violence was repeated. And these were not mere small-scale violence, they were mass-scale violence targeting the Muslims' economy, livelihoods, and overall existence with dignity. In the backdrop of using growing Islamophobia, the Easter Sunday attacks in 2019 was used Sorry, I think I pressed some button and got muted a bit. When the pandemic struck, the Muslim community was accused of being the introducers, carriers, and spreaders of virus and beyond. The spewing of hate and fake stories of Muslims being unpatriotic and undisciplined through both the mainstream and social media was unprecedented and unimaginable, leading up to both the presidential elections in 2019 and the parliamentary elections in 2020. It is in furtherance of this hate and vengeance against Muslims, the right to bury their dead need to be looked at. The pandemic also laid bare institutionalized anti-Muslim traits. There has been prolonged lockdowns and isolation areas and scarce access or supply of essential items, including medicine, when it came to Muslim areas. Due to the forcible cremation policy, the Muslims have been reluctant to seek medical assistance even for regular ailments, thus making them more vulnerable to COVID-19. The government's intransigence was manifested when it debunked its own experts committee's unanimous report that recommended safe burial. This committee consisted of renowned specialists in the relevant fields. The systemic violence of rights and violence against Muslims have also been acknowledged by international independent institutions. The usually cautious Organization of Islamic Cooperation, its Council of Foreign Ministers, and its Permanent Human Rights Commission have all issued statements expressing concerns and have called upon the government repeatedly to respect the sentiments of religious minorities. The UNHRC's special procedure mandate holders have repeatedly written, and as late as 5th of February, a report written collectively by 9 special rapporteurs has, amongst others, reiterated that there has been no established medical or scientific evidence in Sri Lanka or other countries that the burial of dead bodies leads to increased risk of spreading communicable diseases such as COVID-19. They went on to urge the government to stop the forced cremation and to provide remedy and ensure accountability for cremation that were carried out by error. To cap it all, the highest global authority on human rights, the Human Rights Commissioner, Madam Michelle Bachelet, has, amongst others, has this to say in her report to the forthcoming session. The COVID-19 pandemic has also impacted on religious freedom and exacerbated the prevailing marginalization and discrimination suffered by the Muslim community. The High Commissioner is concerned that the government's decision to mandate cremation for all those affected by COVID-19 has prevented Muslims from practicing their own burial rites and has disproportionately affected religious minorities and exacerbated distress and tension. The High Commissioner has gone on to state the government has now demonstrated its inability and unwillingness to pursue a meaningful path towards accountability for international crimes and serious human rights violations. This must be understood to include the serious violations of the rights of the members of the country's Muslim community as well. I must also mention here that despite significant observations and comments, the High Commissioner has also missed out on recommendations relating to the said violations and constitutional derogations of religious practices of religious minorities, and that needs to be fixed. Another significant challenge faced by the Muslim community is the continued patronage politics preferred by Muslim political and also the so-called religious leaderships at the expense of steadfastly standing by principles and or adhering or protecting and promoting the rule of law. A clear case in point is the supporting of the enactment of the 20th Amendment of the Constitution by majority of the Muslim MPs from Muslim parties who were elected on an anti-current regime campaign. And that was in an act of absolute selfishness and tomfoolery, to put it mildly. At the same time, repeatedly, over a period of time, a few Muslims have always been occupying perceived seats of power in the cabinet of ministers or as executive officials whom the community believed they could deliver, but that has not been the case. Therefore, it's also a challenge to convince the Muslim community to start believing in and supporting to strengthen democratic institutions and mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Faiz. And next we're going to hear from Ambika Satyanathan, who is a lawyer, researcher, writer, author, human rights advocate, and former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. Ambika.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Yesterday was the 25th anniversary of the Kumarapuram massacre, in which 26 civilians, including 13 children and a pregnant woman, were killed by army personnel. Yesterday, families of the victims and civil society organizations gathered to remember the victims. First, they were prevented from doing so by the police. Thereafter, they were allowed to conduct the ceremony, but according to civil society activists who were there was heavy police and military presence in the area. And police officers kept instructing them to conclude the ceremony quickly. The question then that we have to ask is, would a government that is committed to accountability and reconciliation do this? Surveillance, harassment, and intimidation of civil society, particularly in the North and the East, is increasing. A civil society colleague in the Eastern Province received phone calls from security officials instructing him to cancel a campaign to release those detained under the PTA. Police personnel threatened to arrest persons who turned up for a demonstration as part of the same campaign in the Northern Province. Another colleague in the Eastern Province received visits to their institution by police intelligence personnel requesting information about their staff, funding, and work plan. Before questions are raised whether these incidents were reported, yes, many of these incidents were reported to the local office of the Human Rights Commission. I'd like to point out that surveillance and intimidation of civil society is part of a continuum, because it didn't entirely disappear during Yahapalnya regime. The difference is that at that time, it was not widespread or common, and at that time, civil society felt they could report it to the Human Rights Commission without facing reprisals. Although the Commission's interventions resulted in the immediate cessation of such extralegal action, the oppressive and extralegal structures and processes remained intact. Most concerning right now is also the labeling of victims, dissenters, human rights defenders, and particularly those who call for accountability or international intervention as traitors, anti-national, and even terrorists. It would not be surprising if the Sri Lankan panelists on this very webinar are called such names in tomorrow's newspapers. This is intimidation and bullying of citizens aimed at preventing them from enjoying their democratic rights. That is the right to dissent, the right to criticize the government and hold it to account. Please ask yourselves if such a government will initiate a credible process to deal with the past. The second issue I'd like to highlight is increased and rapid militarization, not only in the North and East, but also in the entire country, as illustrated by the President using Section 12 of the Public Security Ordinance to call out the armed forces to maintain law and order, appointing military officers to positions in civil administration, the military leading the COVID response, and so on. In this militarized context, there are attempts to also take over land in the North and the East by the Archaeological Department and the Forestry Department. For instance, recently a minister, Vidura Vikramanayaka, in violation of a court order, installed a Buddha statue in Mullaipigu at the site of a Hindu temple. Photographs of the event show that the site was swarming with military personnel. But while we critique militarization, we must remember that militarization of civilian space began aggressively during the first Rajapaksa regime. Contrary to criticisms leveled by the Rajapaksa regime against the Yahapalnya regime, Yahapalnya regrettably did not initiate demilitarization. At most, after 2015, there was a temporary partial freezing of militarization, which resumed with vigor during the second Rajapaksa regime. The third issue I would like to highlight is the continued use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which allows for arbitrary arrest and detention for 18 months without being produced before a magistrate. The most recent arrest using the PTA is that of poet Aunaf Jassim from Mana due to a book of poetry, which supposedly promotes extremism, but according to writers and poets actually calls for an end to extremism. The PTA also creates room for torture, as illustrated by a Human Rights Commission study of prisons, which found that in the study sample, 84% of male PTA inmates said that they'd suffered torture following arrest. An overwhelming majority of those who were subjected to torture, 90%, said they were made to sign confessions after torture. It is also important to note that there have been instances when the Sri Lankan courts have also found that confessions were obtained through torture. Finally, our quests for truth and justice have failed because we have focused only on the nature of governments and not on the nature of the state. That is, a majoritarian state driven by Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, in which the discrimination of numerical minorities is normalized. Moreover, in a patronage-driven society with a feudal hangover, where ethno-nationalism motivates public policy making, the state and its structures are hostile to accountability, particularly for wartime violations. As I have shown, extralegal and oppressive structures and processes remain intact. In this context, do you think the mother of a disappeared person or the family member of a journalist who was extrajudicially killed is likely to see justice in their lifetime? We fear that they will not, because over 70 mothers and fathers have passed away just in the last few years without finding out the truth about the plight of their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthea. And next we will hear from Stephen J. Rapp, who is a senior fellow at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum Center for the Prevention of Genocide and at Oxford University's Center for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. He also serves as chair of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. From 2009 to 2015, he was US Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. In October 2009, his office issued a report concluding that there was credible evidence of serious human rights violations committed in Sri Lanka during the final phase of the conflict in 2008 to 2009. Rapp made official visits to the country in 2012 and 2014 and engaged actively at the UN Human Rights Council during 2012 to 2015 in support of a series of resolutions to further genuine accountability in Sri Lanka. Stephen will speak to us about the international options available.
Thank you very much, Melissa. It's a great honor to be with all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, a good evening. As Melissa said, I'm going to talk about the responses of the international community, the options that are available. But first, I'd like to deal with the question of why the international community is engaged and why the international community should be engaged. And I'm reminded of my own visit to the island in February of 2012 in that regard, because I see, first of all, the fact that as fellow human beings, we have an obligation everywhere in the world to protect the rights, the universal human rights of our fellow humans. And I'm reminded, and that includes, of course, the rights to truth and justice after serious violations of human rights. I'm reminded of the day I was in Molativu and a group of women whose children had gone missing, who themselves were broken and bent from shrapnel that they'd received during the no-fire zone, were in a church and pulled themselves across the room to show me pictures of their children that were missing. They weren't partisans of the LTTE. Indeed, in most cases, the children had been abducted and made into child soldiers, but had been seen later in mid-May, even after the defeat of the LTTE, and then had disappeared. And I promised to follow up and continue to do that. And a few days later, I heard a report back that those women had been harassed by the security service and threatened with jail themselves. And the interpreter that I had during that visit reported to me that the women's response was, if we can't have the truth about our loved ones, you might as well just kill us. You might as well just kill us, because life's not worth living. And that's something I think that all of us in the world need to empathize with and act on, and that what continues to motivate me. The other problem is that there can be further victims in the future, further crimes. I can recall when I was there, I would engage, as we did, and our strategy in the US government for about 3 years was to really press hard for national authorities to live up to their obligations. And I'd hear people say, we need to turn the page. We need to focus on development. These issues are too difficult. We'll alienate the nation's heroes. And what I noted to them was that violations were continuing. They weren't necessarily the same kind of violations, but that people were being abducted. There were crimes and corruption that the same people, some of the same people involved in the violations, were committing these acts. That impunity was contagious, and that the message sent that you could get away with killing innocent people, you could get away with killing people that had surrendered and that were helpless. Facts that were found even by commissions in Sri Lanka, that you could get away with that, led people to think they could get away with other things as well. We saw it during the last few years when there was actually some effort to deal with the so-called emblematic cases. These weren't those that related directly to the end of the conflict. Those seemed to be radioactive. But I can recall in particular the Trinco 11 case of 11 schoolboys abducted during the same time period, but nothing political, nothing terrorist about it at all. They were of different ethnicities and religions, and they were kidnapped and held at the naval base at Trinco by a number of officers in order to extort, in the end, to murder them and to obtain money from their parents. And there were diligent efforts to prosecute those cases, despite obstruction. Multiple individuals that were charged. And now, with this new government, we see that effort, that fledgling effort at justice in dealing with unrelated, to some extent, crimes, but some of the same folks, is being obstructed. There's a commission, this commission on political victimization, which is in fact a commission for the obstruction of justice. And what an outrage it is that the head of that commission that's trying to prevent the prosecution of people involved in the abduction and murder of innocent boys is now head of the missing persons office. And we just see this sort of defiance of the rule of law, of the idea of accountability, and something that creates then an epidemic, frankly, of impunity, which threatens others in the future who could suffer the same kind of crimes from whatever community. And that's why we need to respond. Now, of course, we'll hear from the government, oh, we'll do something ourselves. But we've had before the Lessons Learned Commission, the Reconciliation Commission. Notice the word truth was missing there. They did, however, find there were 6 incidents in which there was strong suspicion of civilians being killed, and no action was taken. A military inquiry closed that investigation without any response. The Paranagama Commission talked about the killing of surrenderees, the white flag killings, the killing of the 12-year-old boy, found that there was credible evidence, no follow-up at all. And now we're even hearing the government, as it tries to deflect the efforts to a resolution in the next council, is talking about a commission to look at what happened on accountability in the past, which of course is another effort to close the door and to obstruct justice. Finally, from an international point of view, what we're doing here is, I think, dealing with the credibility of our whole system. We have other places in the world where horrible things continue to occur, in Syria, in Myanmar, in South Sudan, and elsewhere. And the UN Human Rights Council has become the go-to place in those situations to get commissions established to find the facts and to begin to lay the grounds for accountability. If the message out of the Sri Lanka process is, well, you can wait it out, after 10 years, they can say, well, enough already, close it and let them get on with their business. What does that say for the victims in these other situations? What is the prospect in the future for the credibility in terms of the enforcement and compliance with human rights? It won't be just an epidemic of impunity. It'll be a pandemic of impunity. And that's what the world risks if we don't grasp the obligation that all of us, I think, have, and make sure that we continue this fight for truth and justice for the people of Sri Lanka. So what can be done? First of all, there's the UN side of it, and that's not the only part of it. And very, very pleased with the strong report of the High Commissioner on these issues. Obviously, the need to continue monitoring, whether that's done by her office or by a special rapporteur, extremely important that this stay on the radar screen. But I'm particularly excited by the second recommendation, 61B, that calls for a dedicated capacity to collect and preserve evidence and other related information for future accountability process, and to support universal jurisdiction until and if there's a genuine process at the national level. We've seen that this has been done earlier in the case of North Korea, but most particularly, but in a larger way, in the case of Syria and Myanmar. And of course, the UN has done some great reports in which all of us have been involved in supporting those efforts and assisting those efforts. But it's very important to develop evidence that can be used in court, that connects the dots between the horrors that happen, the people that are killed, the innocents, the helpless that are targeted, and those that really made it happen. Not always the low-level people who are pushed along or draftees in this effort, but those that caused it to occur. And drawing those connections, which we've had to do in my own experience as an international prosecutor in the Rwanda Tribunal, or at Sierra Leone, where I prosecuted a chief of state, that's extremely important. And that is a place where this can be done. And of course, there's a lot of work that's been done and it's done by civil society, but it needs to be vetted and verified. And this can be a resource to national prosecutors when they do have an individual who's in country or someone that they can get their hands on that they can prosecute. And we've seen that even in Syria, where the conflict continues, there's been an excellent case prosecuted in Germany against two officers alleged to be involved in torture, sending a clear signal to those victims back in Molativu and elsewhere that justice is possible. It's not enough, but it's a start. It's a bit of an inoculation against this epidemic of impunity. Additionally, the UN, of course, needs to deal with the vetting of peacekeepers, and there's been positive messaging on that. And in the past, there was the work of the Commission for Human Rights in Sri Lanka working on vetting, and of course, that's no longer independent. It has a minister in charge of it. But now the UN really does need to step up, working with my own country that has a Leahy vetting program, and make sure that people don't go back into peacekeeping, and that we don't rely on Sri Lankan peacekeepers. As important as peacekeeping is in the world, until it cleans up its act and actually follows up on the credible allegations that have been made in the past in terms of the Haiti force and others. And I saw how those were just completely swept under the rug. The UN can't be credible in the world if it sends out peacekeepers with human rights violations, full stop. And the UN itself needs, as Charles reported, certainly in terms of the events of 2009, but this is the continued problem. It can get involved in trying to work in certain areas and then de-emphasizing human rights, putting it on the back burner, wanting to work on technical assistance in some area or another. It can't be conflicted that way. No normalization. Not with a government that's engaged in mass impunity. Not in a government that's defying the rights, the most fundamental rights to truth and justice for people whose very right to life, the most fundamental right, and to human dignity in the Human Rights Declaration are not being upheld. Then what other things can be done? And it's not at the UN, where obviously the UN Security Council would presumably be blocked, where effective action may be limited in terms of the ability to put on sanctions, for instance, as the Security Council has done in other situations. Their individual states can step up, particularly with this global Magnitsky sanctions regimes that have been established in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and now in Europe. As you know, the United States, even under President Trump, put Shavendra Silva on the global Magnitsky list. Others should follow, based upon the evidence, including the evidence that's going to be developed by this dedicated capacity. And that can also open the way for prosecutions of those that may enable those individuals or engage their financial transactions. Those individuals and companies can be prosecuted, as we've had some that have involved billions of dollars in fines for banks that have engaged in transactions with sanctioned individuals. Send that kind of clear message. There are also things in terms of aid and trade, and of course, we don't want people to suffer. Sanctions when they attack a whole nation, I think, are inappropriate, and we need to find ways that target these kind of measures. But of course, at the same time, we have to make demands if international resources are going to go to Sri Lanka, that there be inclusive governance, that it not be a majoritarian, Sinhala state that ignores the interests of Muslims, Hindus, ignores the interests of the Muslim and Tamil communities, and only serves a certain interest. It has to serve all interests, and certainly when even when something so important as the International Monetary Fund's aid, which the government may seek in the near future, in part because of the obligations taken on with China by the previous government, high interest loans for unwise development projects. Now they need aid from the international community. It ought to be a clear condition that Sri Lanka is in fact not going forward with this sort of process of impunity and of only aiding certain communities, but that it be an inclusive process and that there be justice in that process, and there be support to it. These things have to mean something if those victims are going to have their rights to truth and justice, and particularly if we're going to deter violations in Sri Lanka in the future and globally. And that's why the international community, I hope, and I'll certainly be engaged as much as I can, will be seeking to pass a resolution that follows up on the earlier resolutions, follows up on the obligations that the government itself signed on to in unanimous resolution in 2015 for transitional justice, which obviously includes that Truth Commission, which is extremely important and didn't happen, and includes the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for serious violations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And next we will hear from Shreen Sarur, who is a Sri Lankan peace and women's rights activist, founder of the Myanmar Women's Development Foundation to help promote women's empowerment. She is the winner of many international and local awards for her activism promoting women's empowerment, rule of law, and human rights, and a writer. Shreen, over to you.
Thank you. Warm greetings to everybody, and I will just follow up with my three other Sri Lankan panelists, some of the things that are kind of something that's striking that I want to put it to the table. One is with regard to the Muslim community, that we have to view what is happening to the Muslim community as a part of systematic violation that enjoyed culture of impunity. So it is part of that racism. It's a structure of the racism. With regard to the lockdown areas Faiz talked about, it's also very interesting. This whole cremation, forcible cremation, or this policy of forcible cremation it's not just something that happened because of the pandemic alone. This is part of hate mongering, the anti-Muslim attacks that has been ongoing. So it's just something, an opportunity happened to this government to punish the Muslim community as a whole, and also to the government to show that they are trying to make a pure Buddhist country, and that one country and one law. The whole cremation policy is part of that racist venom, that structure. So that's something that we need to acknowledge. With regard to Ambika's points, I want to add a few things with regard to the PTA. Apart from PTA, Sri Lanka has taken the ICCPR Act and then used it against the ethnic minority, and which is very, very important for us to note. And also, more recently, PTA has also used against lots of Muslims. The previous government, the Good Governance government, supposedly, also used the PTA to arrest over 2,000 Muslims in the post-Easter context. And right now, I don't know for concretely the numbers, but over 300 odd Muslims are arrested under PTA. They are being accused of having connection to National Tawfiq Jamaat, which was behind the Easter bombing. And more recently, last 3 months, we have been grappling with 3 women, wives and mothers of who have been arrested. with infant, one starting from 8 months to 12 months to 1.5 year infants being taken with the mothers and kept in TID custody. To date, the families don't have access to these infants and mothers, and we don't know what is happening to them because there aren't anybody left in their family also to look for them. Sometimes the entire family is under detention. So this is something that we need to also to highlight. And also like the surveillance. There are new forms of surveillance. I mean, it's not only intelligence, uniformed men, CID, NIB, all these people, but it is also the Sri Lankan government officers. Right now, it is government state officers who are surveillancing us. This involved the government GA, the government agent, the DS officers, the banks, you name it, anybody that we have become the enemies. And also, like you all aware of the fact that the Sri Lankan National NGO Secretariat was brought under the Defence Ministry, that is under Kamal Gunawardena, and we are supposed to report to the Secretary Kamal Gunawardena. So the problem is many of the NGOs, which are very small, NGOs that I am part of it, also being asked to register, or rather forced to register under the NGO Act. And also, like Sri Lanka is now in the process of passing a very vicious VSSO Act, Voluntary Service Organization Act. So to date, many of the local organizations have been told that we have done illegitimate activities. The illegitimate activities means engaging with any form of transitional justice mechanism, including engaging with OMP, the very mechanism that government set it up. We have been asked by the military guys, asked by the government officers, the information that we gave it to OMP. Well, this is OMP is the government structure. If the military wants, military can go and ask them why every organization that engage with the OMP is systematically targeted is something that High Commissioner's office need to look at it, because the transitional justice process did not just all of a sudden came. It came through 30/1, a resolution, right? It's everybody's responsibility to look at that. And we were also forced to work only on natural disaster and physical construction, that we can't do anything else beyond that. I will talk about one example where one of my colleagues, because of the intimidation, his entire board members have to go away. So he has to start a new, body, and the new board members. Thus, he has to do a resolution, and he went to the bank. The bank manager said, I can't allow you to access your bank account till you register with the NGO Secretariat. This is a private bank, right? Same thing happened with regard to another organization where the government agent has written saying that it is illegitimate to accept foreign funding. Therefore, you have to locally fundraise, and the fundraising is also to work on natural disasters, right? So there is this level of intimidation, and yes, everybody says there is no white van, but this is how Sri Lankan government is making a point that the NGOs don't function in this country, and slowly that we die down, right? So that's very systematically done. With regard to some of the minority rights and the collective positive things that lots of my colleagues have spoken about it, but I want to talk about in the last few months, what is happening in the country is something that is refreshing to many of us. Even though there is a lot of control on freedom of expression, assembly and all, with pandemic and also with militarization, with the dictatorship right now, but people are coming out, whether it's right to, demanding right to memorialization, truth and access to justice, burial issues, workers' right, resistance against land grab, livelihood grabs by the military and the singular majoritarian government, how they are trying to nullify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution by, giving power to the governors that comes directly from the president, that the governors are ordering, the land to be divided and taken, Tamil people's land being taken and given to Sinhalese and all those things. It's direct violation of 13th Amendment, and local authority members are not allowed to function the way that they are supposed to function. The DSS office that has the land right to distribute land has been stopped, or if they do it, they are being penalized. So all these things are happening. But more recently, this the P2P the march, Pothubil to Poligandi. Subha will agree with me that the Muslims came in large numbers to support this and make it very successful. And thanks to Tamil community as well, to like include some of the Muslim issues also, like, and also thanks to some of the Tamil politicians who stood up for the Muslim community's rights. And it has already made the Muslim Tamil community coming together as victims coming together. And these people, P2P movement has to become peoples to people movement. With the political parties coming together, but the challenge here is what Faiz talked about it, that the Sri Lankan Muslim political leadership and Sri Lankan Muslim religious leadership has been bartering Muslim communities' rights for perks and privileges. In that context, it's going to be very difficult for victim community to connect and demand for justice. That is what we need right now in this country. And what Bhavani talked about and Ambika talked about, the rollback, access to justice and all. To date, there is not a single precedent-setting case decision with regard to attacks on minority religious life. So much so, day before yesterday, the Archbishop Malcolm Ranjit called for international investigation on the Easter attack, because the 3 commissions that were set up by the Sri Lankan government, the previous Hapalaniya 2 commissions and then the Rajapaksa, all these commissions failed to give justice to the minority religious community that was suffered part of this attack. And also the Muslim community really want to know what happened. How did the Easter bombing happen, and how did government fail to prevent this attack? So it's very important to kind of like finding justice, like outside the country as well. People are articulating that. The minority religious community is articulating that. And very interestingly, the forthcoming Geneva session, it's going to be the stage to show how Muslim and Tamil, or rather Tamil-speaking community is going to come together, how the politicians are going to, kind of weaken that process. As you all know, currently the Justice Minister is a Muslim, and also Sri Lankan government hearing High Commissioner's report set up 3-member human rights committee to investigate into human rights violation. All of a sudden they have woken up. The head of it is also Muslim. So you will have 2 Muslims coming and countering and telling nothing is happening to the Muslim community. We will take care of Sri Lanka rights violation and all those things. So that's very problematic, because during previous Rajapaksa regime, it was a Muslim justice minister who, with the religious leaders and politicians, went to Geneva to defend Rajapaksa regime previously. And that is still a scar with the Tamil minority community. Still, reaching out to that community has been very difficult, even though there are some positive things that I talked about it. The other thing I want to raise is about this whole dividing and ruling the minority community is now coming with Pakistan coming in. Imran Khan is coming to Sri Lanka on the 23rd. On the 24th, he is addressing the Sri Lankan Parliament, exactly the day the High Commissioner is going to present her oral report. What does it mean to us? Imran Khan also is coming from China's backing, and China is going to back Sri Lanka to walk out of the resolution, and Imran Khan is going to lobby the OIC countries. So what it means to the Muslim countries to back the resolution is something very questionable, whereas Muslim community in Sri Lanka really want justice, and many of the victims of the forced cremation have gone to different levels of the judicial process in Sri Lanka, whether it's magistrate court or district court. The writ applications have been filed in appeal court. Supreme Court has just thrown a request. So they are also now filing case with UN Human Rights Committee under the optional protocol, ICCPR optional protocol. So that also indicates that the victims need access to justice outside Sri Lanka because they are not finding anything positive in country. And then with regard to High Commissioner's report, it is a fresh air to see the triple IM being mentioned, because this is something that the victim communities asked in 2015 when OISL report was finalized in March 2015. It took some time for it to come, but then still people were asking about triple IM mechanism to be set up so that their evidence can be gathered in systematic way. But it's a bit too late, because right now much of the evidence that we have gathered have either been destroyed, or we are compelled to destroy the evidence that we have collected. So I don't know how communities can help to get the evidence back again, but it's too late. But I hope the High Commissioner's office can help this being set up, so that at least we can preserve some of the like evidence that is still with the communities and with people outside the country. In addition to that, I also sorry
to interrupt. I'm afraid we're running a bit over time.
Okay, I'll just finish.
Come back to this in the discussion. Yeah.
Okay. In addition to that, I also want to highlight High Commissioner's recent mandate, that is October 2020 Resolution 45/31, which talks about conflict prevention. To continue to strengthen the capability of her office to identify, verify, manage, and analyze the data and early warning sign emerging from all sources, for her to also use that to Sri Lanka, and also the 10 special rapporteurs who have visited Sri Lanka and published 4 visits and the recommendation. There are over 400 recommendations. If Sri Lanka walks out of all these things, it's shame on all these special rapporteurs' hard work, and also the victim communities work with the special rapporteurs. This also will set a trend that the special rapporteur procedures have been taken for granted by the Sri Lankan government. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Shreen, and apologies for interrupting. We now have our final speaker. Maithia Paranan Sumanthiran is a Member of Parliament, spokesperson for the Tamil National Alliance, and President's Council. Over to you, Sumanthiran.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I've been asked to speak and say the obvious, why domestic mechanisms will not work in Sri Lanka. That's quite obvious, but it may be important to just trace back a few events from the past. In 2006, there was a commission of inquiry set up under international pressure by the previous Rajapaksa government to inquire into serious human rights violations. There were 15 or 16 cases identified. And then there was another panel set up to monitor its work. That was called IGEP, International Independent Group of Eminent Persons, headed by Justice Bhagwati. After a while, Justice Bhagwati's commission, or the eminent group of persons, withdrew their mandate and stated that they cannot continue this work because Sri Lanka lacks the political will to investigate serious violations of human rights in the country. Now, this has again been reflected in the High Commissioner's report. I can see at paragraph 56, she says Sri Lanka's, calls it inability and unwillingness to pursue a path towards accountability. So we've had many instances, too numerous to recount, but there have been some cases where they have done a showcase trial and convicted 1 or 2 individuals in the past. But even in those instances, we saw how on appeal they were acquitted. Except one single case, all of those prosecutions have ended up with the acquittal, or even when the highest court confirmed the conviction and sentence, there had been executive pardon given. The most recent being that of Army Sergeant Sunil Ratnayaka, who was found guilty by a 3-judge panel, and then later his conviction and sentence were confirmed by a 5-judge panel of the Supreme Court, murdering 5 persons, including a toddler and another child, by slitting their throats. Now he is a free person. He's been pardoned by the present president. In between 2015 and 2019, while the Sri Lankan government co-sponsored resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council, we had a window opportunity, or so we thought, of the government agreeing and working towards proper accountability mechanism, a hybrid court, and so the details of that were spelled out in 30/1, with the participation of international judges, prosecutors, investigators, etc. But even when the Sri Lankan government co-sponsored resolutions 3 times, the government back home told the people that they will not allow foreigners to participate in these proceedings as judges. So the intention was clear. Even when they told the international community that they would do it, and they repeated it twice for local consumption, it was very clear that they were not going to do it. And now, of course, the new second Rajapaksa regime has officially written to the Human Rights Council that they will not cooperate in any of these matters. Not just the accountability, but also in matters concerning reconciliation, which is very important, because the guarantee of non-recurrence can only happen through a process in which all peoples in Sri Lanka can feel and know that they're equal citizens. And so the new constitution has to be created with proper power sharing arrangements. We did that for a while, an exercise during the last government, but that fell apart when the government also fell. The accountability issue, though, will not move in the UN Human Rights Council. We know that. We've tried that for 11 years. And even with co-sponsorship by the Sri Lankan government, it did not even start off. And so the only option that we have is the International Criminal Court. There is no other option at present. Sri Lanka is not a signatory to Rome Statute, and therefore cannot be compelled. Sri Lankan citizens cannot be compelled and brought before that court, except through a Security Council resolution. And that seems too far-fetched, given the friends Sri Lanka has, who are permanent members, who have right of veto, etc. But nevertheless, for lack of any other mechanism, we've now started a process of asking the international actors to start on a path towards the ICC. Of course, universal jurisdiction, sanctions, particularly travel bans targeting individuals, will be very, very effective, and that countries that are committed to human rights values should pursue. We've so far had only one person travel ban, but if we escalate that, I think the message will be delivered that impunity cannot continue forever. It's been a long, hard road for the victims, and they've lost any hope. Yet they strive for justice, and as someone who represents that community and those people who still come on the street, and as Stephen said when he met some of them, that's the kind of experience we have day in and day out. we have to do justice for those people. It is for the sake of those people, as well as for the sake of future generations, because if impunity is not nipped in the bud, as Stephen said, it becomes a pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumantharan. We're now going to move on to the part of the event which will be the panel discussion and the Q&A. We are running a little bit over time, so if possible, we will extend a little bit at the end of the event and run over for about 10 minutes or so to try and answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. So the first question that I have is for any of the panelists. Is from Mario, from Advisor to Pearl. Given that Sri Lanka's problems with regards to accountability and impunity are systemic and rooted in the nature of the state, and not the government in power, what lessons can be taken from the international community's failure to hold Sri Lanka to its commitments so far? Who wants to take that? Anyone? How about you, Pablo? You start us off?
Melissa, I am very glad to start you off, but if you do not mind, the signal was breaking, so I missed part of the question. Please restate it. And I will...
Given that Sri Lanka's problems with regards to accountability and impunity are systemic and rooted in the nature of the state and not the government in power, what lessons can be taken from the international community's failure to hold Sri Lanka to its commitments so far?
Okay, thank you very much. This is actually a topic that I think is very important and dear to my heart, which has a lot to do with the way in which we understand prevention work. Including the discussions about prevention within the UN system. I think that we pay a lot of lip service to the notion of a broadened and to use the UN lingo upstream the prevention strategy. But in reality, the work continues to focus a lot on crisis prevention and on the role of the international community. And as important as I think that is, and as important as I think that, for example, early warning systems are, anything that is capable of triggering an early warning system means that we have failed to do a lot of preventive work beforehand. So I think that what we need, one of the lessons that I derive from this is that we have to stop praising rhetorically the idea of a broader prevention strategy and working out systematically what that means. Some of the elements are well known. In fact, this is not rocket science. And the problem with prevention is not necessarily that we do not know how to do it. The problem is lack of commitment on the one hand, and on the other, the disaggregation of knowledge and expertise at the UN system level. I think that a much more integrated approach that includes elements like, for example, legal and constitutional tools, advising countries about how to remove, for example, discriminatory provisions from their constitutions. Advising governments on strengthening the independence of the judiciary, increasing their capacities to carry out effective investigations. These are nuts and bolts elements of a preventive strategy that I think are not taken sufficiently seriously at the international level. So I think that we should once again confirm the importance of the fact that prevention is a long-term process that we should not pay attention to it only when a country is on the brink of a disaster, but long, long before. And in my thinking about prevention and about the idea of a systematic framework, Sri Lanka looms very large, to be perfectly honest, because this is a country with a long history of cycles of violence across all communities, with institutions that could have easily prevented those cycles of violence. But I think that the international community has focused on the wrong topics, to be perfectly frank, that the bulk of preventive work takes place not through diplomatic good offices, as important as that is. The bulk of preventive work takes place at the local level with initiatives that range from the micro level of policing strategies to the macro level of constitutional reforms to make the political pact truly inclusive. And we know how to do all these things. So the role of the international community is to take seriously its own words about prevention, to provide the assistance, and to provide the leverage for countries to actually undertake the serious reforms that would diminish the likelihood of mass violations of the sort that Sri Lanka has already known in its past, and that unfortunately, in all estimations, is posed to revisit in the future.
Thank you for kicking us off on that one, Pablo. Ambika, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you, Melissa. I think a few lessons to be learned. One, I think, is not just in Sri Lanka, but globally, the international community tends to focus a lot on the formal structures, the law. And they think that by setting up institutions or by changing the law that you make a difference. Yes, you do, but only to a certain extent, because if you do not change the culture, nothing changes. I speak from experience of 5 years of being a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, where I learned this, where we could make a difference only until we were there. So the change should not be tied to an individual, it should be tied to the institution and to the process. The other, I think the second thing is about addressing root causes. If a government does not address the root causes, so here successive governments have been reluctant to address the nature of the state, what underpins it, the values, the ethos, the ideology. Unless you deal with that, I think you will not be able to address any of these issues in a substantive way. And I think finally, it's also about when the international community comes into such a country. And at that time, I think Sri Lanka was like the hope, along with Myanmar at one point, when the rest of the world was falling apart. So then there is, I think, a pressure to also show success, and which means you are willing to also take crumbs and you do not push as much as you should. And I think that is a mistake, because the international community, even now we see, is taking that approach to fall, as Pablo said, falling for rhetoric and not pushing. I think those are, I would say, 3 lessons to be learned.
Thank you, Ambika. Bhavani?
Thanks, Melissa. I think, look, the speakers have already raised some of the key issues, but in addition, I would say really look at some of the lessons from Sri Lanka, and unfortunately, we have so many lessons that we need to look at. Look at even just the knee-jerk reaction to appoint commissions of inquiry as a response when there's pressure on accountability. Just what the successive governments, I say successive governments, keep going back to. So understanding the rhetoric, understanding the fact that these are going to come about, the usual excuses, the delay tactics. But Pablo's point, I think, is so critical. The structural changes. I mean, the culture is definitely necessary, but the structures take decades. And work we have done, I mean, I don't know how to underscore this. If you do not have independent institutions that can investigate, that can prosecute, and that can stay the course, we are just going, I mean, we also keep doing this in terms of the impunity, because I think the whole, the group of presentations today shows the scale of violations, violence, the cycles of violence. But if we keep going from one crisis to the other and forget very, very basic institutional structures, we will have the same conversation in a few years' time. So while we need to look at international options, we also need to build the structures in Sri Lanka, because end of the day, we have to start fixing things here. So to have an independent Attorney General's Department, prosecutors, these are the same individuals that are getting attacked now. Political victimization is very real for the individuals who worked on these cases. So we need to look at all of these things. So it's not, I don't say prioritizing, everything needs to happen. It's long-term work that needs to happen. And finally, the importance that Charles raised in terms of the UN. The UN is hand in glove with governments. And in Sri Lanka, they are very involved. And I think there has to be responsibility when the UN engages as well, that it's a principled approach, that is, it's not the practical, pragmatic development focus alone. The principal approach and lessons learned in terms of that as well. So that is also critical.
Thank you, Bhavani. Samantharan, you wanted a word on this as well.
Just one word, since someone referred to the root causes, and I did say in my earlier presentation as well, a new constitution, new rules of engagement between the peoples who inhabit this island is important. And this government has actually appointed a committee to draft a new constitution, but it will be in the opposite direction to what we all expect it to move on. So there is now another live danger of the constitutional process regressing or going in the opposite direction. They have a 2/3 majority in parliament, and with the right rhetoric, they can even get it over at a referendum. So while we are looking at progress, what we might actually end up with is the opposite of that. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question comes from Amal Abayawardena from the UK. There were countless atrocities committed by the LTTE who violated the rights of Tamils that they claim to represent. There is a lack of confidence in Sri Lanka that these crimes will be investigated or acknowledged by the UN. How can the international community help by investigating human rights violations on all sides, including those committed during the JVP uprisings and the IPKF period, and investigating the role of the supporters of the LTTE who supplied material resources to the Tigers when human rights violations were committed? Stephen, you spoke about international justice. Perhaps you can pick that one up for us. Thank you.
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why this mechanism would be very important. And I would note that, you know, the Dutch had a case involving LTTE support. And so to some extent, that's where we've had precedents. I would note that obviously we didn't have justice in any significant way about LTTE violations in Sri Lanka, albeit by a government that hated the LTTE. I remember raising this issue with Defense Secretary Gotabaya, now President Rajapaksa, when I was there, and saying, you know, we're willing to assist you, anything you can do. Of course, recalling that many of the individuals that could have been charged were, in fact, according to credible evidence, killed after surrender. Numbers of around 360 that are given out. So the number of suspects for violations that may have occurred in the conflict zone wasn't there. And I remember the Defense Secretary saying, "Oh, trials, you know, they go on so long and people get off." And then he said, "I killed them. You know, that's not justice. justice is when you hear about the evidence, when victims are able to come forth and talk about their children being abducted. Supposedly one child would be taken for the LTT. In many cases, multiple children were taken, and these were horrors. And we had attacks on buses and the use of suicide bombers, etc. Some of the things that that happened in the rest of the world, child soldiers, suicide bombers, in a sense, came to us from Sri Lanka. So it's important to have justice on both sides, on all sides, and indeed that could still happen on the island. Instead we have things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act and an emphasis on sort of saying someone's associated on one side or another, or digging out evidence of someone's political connections, et cetera, not on the conduct. And what you fundamentally need, and this is so important even as we deal with terrorism prosecutions in the West, is conduct. The murder of innocents, the sexual slavery, the torture, the other things that sometimes occur from non-state actors. This is what needs to be presented, as it certainly does from the point of view of state actors. Of course, the state actors that were involved in these crimes that have been identified and mentioned and that we're familiar with haven't been prosecuted, and some went on to commit other offenses and to engage in acts of corruption. And that clearly sends a bad signal. So that justice needs to be even-handed and needs to be done fairly. And of course, at the international level, often it'll depend on whether in a particular country there's a target over which they have jurisdiction. So that's the imperfect way to do it. The far better way would have been the recommendation that the government subscribed to in Resolution 30/1 to have a court with international presence that would have given credibility. I recall in other places where for instance, in Bosnia, where we had a state court and it had people from each of the three communities, but initially people from the international community, and victims were much more confident, at least at the beginning, when they saw someone from the international community, because they said, well, this isn't a person that's a partisan here. And so it does, even though in the end, I think the domestic participants did a fantastic job there, it aids that perception of independence. And it's so tragic that this wasn't taken up, that it wasn't implemented, that nothing really happened in that regard, even under this coalition government that we had during the period between 2015 and 2019.
Thank you, Stephen. Ambika?
Thank you, Melissa. I mean, I agree with Mr. Rapp about that justice has to be even-handed and we have to investigate all violations. I don't think we disagree on that. But I would like to just point out two things. Is that one is that the UN, when I think Radhika Kumaraswamy was the UN Special Representative on Children in Armed Conflict, there were several reports that she presented to the Council about recruitment of child soldiers by the LTTE. So I think to say that the UN is in denial is counterfactual. The second point is in relation to how the government views accountability. So for now, if you're talking about violations committed, there are two persons in the current government who are alleged to have committed those violations, including the massacre of 600 policemen, abduction of children, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances. So if the government is actually serious about accountability, why doesn't it stop there? Why doesn't it prosecute them? Then when we ask that question, what the answer that we get is that, they helped us defeat the LTTE. So is that how accountability is supposed to work? Is that how justice is supposed to work? If you help us, it doesn't matter what you did in the past, we wipe the slate clean. But if you're against us, then God forbid, we will use all ammunition to come after you.
Thank you, Ambika. And Pablo?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think that in my brief intervention, I talked about the fact that the very project of human rights in Sri Lanka is one that is seen as a zero-sum game and of interest to just one community. And this is, of course, one of the things that has to be overcome. one of the manifestations of which is the lack of even-handedness in the administration of justice. So I think that it is absolutely critical for the institutions to send the message that the only criterion that is sufficient, in fact, to trigger the operation of, for example, the criminal justice system is the violation of a right, of a fundamental right, independently of all other considerations, including membership in a community, ethnicity, religion, or whatever. We are talking about the rights of all Sri Lankans. And unless the institutions commit themselves to realizing that idea, I think that we're going to be talking about these issues again and again. Bhavani made the very important point. I think that Sri Lankan institutions rely for good governance on the great virtue of particular individuals. But that means that the institutions, in fact, are extraordinarily weak, that they perform only on the initiative of people who have great virtue. This is not the way that a country secures the rights of citizens. And it is typically a problem that has been overcome by middle-income countries such as Sri Lanka, which have institutions in which, for example, prosecutions and investigations are carried out ex officio, not because of the initiative of particularly courageous individuals. And of course, I am praising them, but I am saying the country cannot rely simply on the fact that there are some people with heroic dispositions in their midst. It needs real institutions and an understanding of human rights as the embodiment of generalizable interests, not the interest of one particular community.
Thank you, Pablo. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to the next question. Although if panelists want to come in on previous questions that they haven't been able to comment on, please do so in your answers. So we have a question from Anandaraj Panambalam from the USA. When Sri Lanka refuses to adhere to human rights for segments of its population, how can you say that the solution should be from within Sri Lanka? I wonder, Bhavani, if you could comment on that, because you've spoken a little bit about institution building within Sri Lanka and the importance of that.
Thank you, Melissa. You know, I think when listening to panels such as this, and there's been a few, you realize the scale of violence and violations, and it's not a new thing. So it cycles, no? And we get heartened when there are small windows where we can make some progress and we get excited. And I think for those in Sri Lanka who've been doing this for so long, and some in the panel have done it for much longer than me, we try to see the positives. And at least say, okay, there are some windows. I still think there are still windows in Sri Lanka. As a Sri Lankan working here, I think we need to have that optimism. But I think what many of us have said is that space is shrinking very, very fast. And if steps are not taken now within Sri Lanka, but with the support of the international community, I think what we miss amidst this rhetoric at this moment is it's seen as this international community is against us, against Sri Lanka. And if you look at what has been happening over the years, it's to support Sri Lanka. It's to support Sri Lankans get to address reconciliation, to address human rights. The unfortunate thing that we've also spoken about is the immense challenges and the structures that keep pushing back. The racism, the ethno-nationalism, it's there. We are not denying that. But the fact that 2015 and for a few years, we had a few opportunities mean I'm optimistic that we can get there. But it's going to be a much harder road. And I think one lesson, if anything, we can learn from the more recent exercise is we all need to be better prepared. We all need to start building those blocks even though we are revisiting some of these conversations. Now, what Shreen alluded to in terms of what happened last week in the Northern East is something we need to really factor in, that people, Muslims and Tamils, many spontaneously came out and walked despite the numerous challenges thrown at them. This was 50,000 or more. Let's not get stuck in the numbers. People walked because they feel they needed to walk. The space is shrinking so fast that they needed to get out and do it. I think there are some other things that are happening. I mean, maybe not as large as that, but there are conversations happening. There are people going to court. There are people, despite the COVID regulations, people make statements, find different ways of challenging, countering, having that narrative. So I want to say that, yes, it looks gloomy, but let's also look at this as a long term. It's not just March, the council, and it's over. It's not. What happens to the next day after the March session is over? What happens then? It's the Sri Lankans who have to deal with it. And who will be there then to talk about it and take those challenges forward? So, yes, it looks dire, but I want to raise this very pertinent question. We are having a special presidential commission of inquiry that is already sitting and going to target 20 odd individuals or possibly more. Mr. Sumandiran is one of them. There are others. They're going to gut the investigations, go after prosecutors, go after those who genuinely work towards accountability, transparency. What is it that we're going to do in Sri Lanka? Because I think these are hard questions that goes beyond the March session. So just to say that I think we need to keep the resilience, the optimism, all of that. But it doesn't end in the next few weeks. It doesn't end after March. It's a long struggle forward.
Thank you, Bhavani. We have a question here from Saroj Pathirana, who's a journalist, commenting on the continued detention of lawyer Hejaz Hizbullah and the use of the PTA in general. Baroness Kennedy, the director of IBARI, insisted the due process doesn't seem to be adhered to. She has also expressed concern about the arrest of a senior detective, Shani Abesekara, who has been investigating serious crime in Sri Lanka. She says that she would like to be persuaded that Sri Lanka is not following a pattern of actually incarcerating people because they don't like them. What are your views on that? Do you have a comment on her intervention? Who would like to take that?
May I? Go ahead, Shreen. Okay. So this is a continuing spectacle that we see of targeting persons who stand up. Hejaz Hizbullah is a big example in this. No charges yet and not being produced before a judge for so long. And despite all the pressure, the government is just sitting it out and want to make a spectacle of him so that others, chill and will not do anything. Same thing about the poet. There was one other, Ramzi Razik, who wrote something. Fortunately, he's now out on bail. But this young poet from Mana, who actually wrote against extremism, and they say he's inciting extremism, and they're so they are targeting this kind of thing. And also, what is worse is that during the last government, the prosecutors, Bhavani mentioned that the prosecutors and others who worked diligently on cases and try to take accountability forward are themselves being targeted now by these presidential commissions, and they are going to be prosecuted. for politically victimizing these offenders. The shrinking space, I mean, it's an understatement to say that the space is shrinking. We are sitting in a space where we can't even stretch our feet or expand our elbows or anything like that tight and like this, and very soon there'll be a plaster put across our mouths as well.
Thank you, Sri.
I just want to add some of the cases Honorable Sumandran spoke about the featured cases, but to my knowledge, from November, the memorialization process, my count is over 48 people have been detained under PTA. Unknown. People are not even aware. Their cases have not come out to the surface, including somebody from the local authority just writing a poem saying, remembering one of the martyr. So this is something that we need to carefully look at it, how Sri Lankan government has been using PTA in large scale to arrest anybody, and also some of the even though the mothers have not been arrested or thrown, I know this P2P time, one of the mother's son has been taken briefly under custody. Another mother has got 17 court orders. 17 court orders. And another mother has a military checkpoint set up next to her house. So that much of surveillance, whether she is thrown into the prison or the military is surveillancing, it's somewhat similar. So these are things that we need to think about, what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreen. The next question comes from Shamindra Fernando from Sri Lanka. And his question is, can the panelists explain why the UN confidentiality clause prevented verification of allegations until 2031, and why the UN report prepared with the support of the ICRC and Vani-based NGOs was not considered? This question is obviously quite detailed and goes into some detail. I think it's about obviously the Sri Lankan government has repeatedly denied that war crimes took place towards the end of the war and in the war, during the war. Do any of the panelists have a comment on the Sri Lankan government narrative about the war crimes during the Sri Lankan Civil War?
Well, I could jump in. I mean, frankly, I mean, the position of this government and a previous government is totally lacking in credibility. Even as I noted, in the LLRC report, they indicated that there were 6 incidents in which civilians were killed that called for investigation. Of course, there were far, far more than that. And one gets into numbers games or disputes, and it's impossible to calculate, but certainly, I've talked to people like the Bishop of Myanmar, who calculates more than 100,000 people being killed during the final period of the conflict, when people were in these no-fire zones being torn to pieces. But certainly tens of thousands were killed and are no longer there. And there's never been any acceptance of responsibility, even an acknowledgement of it, even a sort of statement that this was collateral damage and that these were justified or anything like that. Sometimes they say it was a zero casualty operation, which is ludicrous. But and certainly in terms of the laws of armed conflict of IHL, there were clear violations, and there was certainly deprivation of humanitarian assistance within that area, things that have been documented before. But then we've got the cold-blooded killings at the end of the conflict, and senior officials are involved. And it's one of the reasons why this missing persons process always becomes so opaque, because obviously the numbers don't add up. If they started actually dealing with what happened to this person, this person, this person, and dug into it, of course, it would point straight to the top. And so the whole process has lacked credibility. Occasionally you get, and certainly from people like Fonseca, former General Fonseca, etc., acknowledgement of the brutality of the conflict, etc., while raising issues about the white flag killings that he wasn't responsible for. But it's lacked credibility and continues to do so. And it's why it's so why this international community needs to continue to be engaged. Now you talk about, the ICRC, and of course they were present sometimes, though they were denied access to the detention camps. They had the ability to deal with people that had actually been put into judicial proceedings, but of course their whole practice is to maintain confidentiality and the hope that they can have access and the hope that they can further compliance, and so we have to work with that. But certainly credible investigations that have been conducted, including information from satellite photography and other things, make it clear that serious violations occurred for which there has been zero accountability. And that leaves aside the white flag, not white flag, but the white van abductions, the other emblematic cases, the violations in the rest of the country, the ongoing impunity. It is an outrageous situation. And then, of course, when you do have these incidents that happen in plain sight and somebody's finally convicted, you have a presidential pardon. I do want to note, as an American and as someone that very happy that the United States will return to engagement at the Human Rights Council, that every country has challenges. We've seen the fragility of our own democracy. We all have to recognize that we have responsibilities in our own country to confront situations where our own systems turn out to be insufficiently robust when it comes to holding individuals to account, when things become highly politicized or tribalized in a way. And that's it's not just Sri Lanka, but here you've had these horrendous violations and nothing done, and governments actually elected on a campaign of impunity and now conducting this obstruction of justice process, going after the honest people. I mean, I've talked to police officers who discussed how they were really engaged with the families and these people, and they really were going to do something, and indeed they end up being attacked for doing their jobs, and some of that gives me hope. I mean, there are windows there, but this government wants to close every one of those windows, and all we can do from the international community is to signal support for people in Sri Lanka and do what we can from the outside to basically send the message that we're not going to rest. This is not going to be closed. There's going to be every avenue used. There's no normalization. There's no turn the page and forget about it. No, we're gonna be on this, and I think that's what's required of all of us. But of course, as we deal with problems in our own country and elsewhere, we want to partner with the people who've suffered from these violations in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to come to Charles next, please.
Yeah, I guess the confidentiality issue, I'm not very, I wouldn't be able to address, but following up what Stephen said, actually there's a lot of documentation on what happened. I saw a lot of it. I think we've all seen a lot of it. There was that independent investigation before the panel that actually it's the reason why Secretary General Ban Ki-moon set up the panel, the internal panel, was because of the independent investigation. So there is a lot of documentation that exists, which reinforces the importance of continuing to document. I think, I don't know if it was Pablo or Stephen who was saying that you need to be able to continue to document in order to be ready when the moment comes when something can be done. I think the last thing in terms of documentation and in terms of the UN actually lived through the no-fire zone. You have the story of the 11th convoy 11, that was, I would suggest, was actually used as bait for the establishment of a no-fire zone. So not only is there documentation in terms of interviews that were done from victims, but there's also documentation in terms of what the UN lived through and UN personnel lived through and how they documented it internally. So I think there's absolutely no question about what happened in the pocket. It just hasn't been dealt with. But the information, I mean, the proof is there.
Thank you, Charles. I'm going to come to one final question. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of questions and a lot of interest, so thanks to the audience for engaging with us. But we're going to have one final question before we come to final remarks from the panelists, just in the interest of time. So the final question is from the USA. Just like the apartheid regime in South Africa, the Rajapaksa regime will only respond to an economic boycott. Will the world understand that and go for it? Stephen, you commented earlier on economic sanctions and so on.
Yeah, and indeed, we are in an era where we want to be smarter about our sanctions, though I do think it's important that people remember that the world coming together on apartheid in South Africa had an impact, and the fact that we even had sanctions adopted in the U.S. over a presidential veto, I think was quite important. So sometimes you need to do those kinds of things. Obviously, to the extent that you can target this at the perpetrators and limit their ability to use foreign financial institutions, indeed, and travel bans and everything else, and the sort of message that when you get out there you might be prosecuted. That's an extremely important message. But I do think that the idea of development is normal, or trade is normal. We had, of course, during the earlier period, the GSP plus, preference for textiles coming from Sri Lanka. That's really a kind of reward that should only be there for a country that's observing the relevant standards. Those things are important. It needs to hurt. And certainly when it comes to the IFIs, as we call them, the international financial institutions. And I know in my own government, there's real reluctance to use those tools or the votes that the U.S. has, but several times our Congress has passed laws that require the U.S. to vote in a particular way. And so, people can go to their own parliaments in Europe or in America and say, we shouldn't vote this particular way until we have 1, 2, 3. And with clear conditions and reasonable ones. But obviously, if you're talking about development, it needs to be balanced. It needs to be you need to have the rule of law. If you don't have the rule of the law, anything you built can be torn down the next day. So, it's crazy to think you can develop on a rotten foundation, to be frank. And I think that's the message that clearly has to be in the minds of people that are engaged in development and trade and everything else, that there should be conditions and that's one of the ways in which you can have an impact.
Thank you, Stephen. Faiz, would you like to come in on this one?
Well, as spoken or as adverted to earlier, echoing what Ambassador Rapp said, we need to be smart on sanctions. And then, we have also built up the current entire population on rhetorics and pseudo slogans. So targeting sanctions to the country as a whole may not be the right thing to go as a first startup thing. So as the High Commissioner had pointed out, we need to work on clarified individual sanctions. As Mr. Sumandran adverted to, travel bans would be the thing to start. And of course, individual application of universal jurisdiction to individuals who have been credibly identified with violations would be a way to go. And then, we have also felt already, rightly or wrongly, the travel sanction on the current army commander is hurting, and then that is making people to think about it. So I think to limit it to individual sanctions as recommended or as going to be recommended as mentioned in the High Commissioner's report to the sessions would be the way to go, and not targeting the country as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Faiz. Okay, we are now running 9 minutes over, so thank you to all of our panelists for extending the time for us. I just want to come to closing remarks from each of our panelists. If you could keep them short, please, that would be great. And I'm going to do that in the opposite order from which you spoke. So I'll come to Samantha Rand first, please.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you everyone who gave your comments and those who participated and asked questions as well. As we have already said, we are living in very hard times and looking at a very bleak future as well. So it is at this point in time that the sessions of the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council happens. And what happens there is of enormous importance because that sends signals whether or not it is binding on the country. Signals are very important. And so I think we need to work on a very strong resolution coming out of the UN Human Rights Council at this session. Secondly, sanctions. I was going to say something at the last question. Individual targeted sanctions work very well. And since the High Commissioner has now, I think even previously it has been mentioned, and this time she has pressed it hard. And I'd like to see something in the resolution with regard to that as well, encouraging member states to take on themselves and take this forward. And thirdly, on accountability, whether there can be a serious effort taken to take the perpetrators to the International Criminal Court, however difficult the path may be. Can we start on that process? And fourth and finally, the guarantee of non-recurrence, as I said twice before, the international community needs to come in on the discussion of the new rules of engagement, and that is a new constitution, so that there is a fresh social contract that is established for the future for all citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Sri?
So I want to reiterate a strong resolution, particularly focusing on accountability in the forthcoming Geneva session. Particularly, I mean, one of the things that High Commissioner has talked about is this, extraterritorial and international jurisdiction. So that need to be carefully looked at it, and also somehow preserve the evidence that is already being halfway through in the destruction process. The second one, again, I'm going to reiterate the High Commissioner's new mandate to prevent conflict. As women of this country, we have seen enough. And this, there is a kind of a religious conflict brewing in this country, and we have already had 30 years long conflict, bloody end to it, and we don't want another conflict. So she has to take that mandate of October 2020 resolution of 40/31 and take the early warning sign that we are giving now, and make sure that she raised Sri Lanka on specially organizing intersessional briefing to the Human Rights Council, and also the special mandate holders to keep pushing Sri Lanka with regard to their recommendation, particularly forthcoming UPR session and other sessions, to keep Sri Lanka focused. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yes, I would like to underline that recommendation for the dedicated capacity. And of course, the UN has done some great work here with the panel of experts and with the OISL investigation. Though I know myself from dealing with prosecution at the other end of this and working with national prosecutors, quite often when they turn to the UN and they ask for the information, they say, well, the witnesses didn't get conformed consent. We've got nobody to go back and check. There isn't a lot sometimes of assistance available. And a mechanism like this would allow the witnesses to be spoken to, would allow videos, including the videos taken by soldiers themselves of some of these horrors, to be verified within the modern technology that can eliminate the fakes and determine whether they're real. And to really build the dossiers in ways that when there was an opportunity in a third country, or hopefully an opportunity in the future, that evidence will be there in a verifiable way. And that's something we can do now. And if we don't have this, it won't happen. And then it won't be there when there's that opportunity for justice. So it's something that we can do now. It's not as good as the Syria or Myanmar one. It's going to be much smaller, but it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Ambika?
Yeah, unmuting myself. Yes, just to say, I mean, what we have is a culture of denial here. There's institutions are dysfunctional and there is a lack of trust. The citizens, particularly the Tamil and Muslim communities, don't trust the state and especially not this government. The problem is that the government doesn't seem to care about these communities. So how can we believe the government when it says it will deal with the past? The worrying factor is that even the opposition is still speaking of domestic accountability mechanisms, and the leader of the opposition was critical of the travel ban against the army commander. So while agreeing that change does have to come within Sri Lanka, yes, we Sri Lankans are responsible for it, but we do need international pressure and involvement to bring about changes within Sri Lanka. If not, successive governments that do not even acknowledge there was an ethnic conflict, which to date, the root causes of which have not been addressed, are not going to address these root causes. Thank you.
Thank you. Faiz?
Reiterating the need for a resolution to address the issues meaningfully, and also reiterate that the pressure does impact, although there are rhetoric about we don't care about the UN, we don't care about the resolution and things like that. We just saw a couple of days ago on the eve of Pakistani Prime Minister's impending arrival, no less a person than the Prime Minister himself getting up in Parliament and saying things that he could not even keep up, or his office that couldn't keep up. So pressure does work in a way, but then taking on from there is, amongst other things, is that we also need to figure out amongst Sri Lankans ourselves, like Ambika said, the opposition also plays to the gallery and keeps misleading the masses, the majority of the masses, without informing them of the truth. So dissemination of the truth and what needs to be done in country to treat or to a culture to evolve, that every citizen, every member of every community would be treated equally, is also things that we need to explore and invest our energies on. Thank you.
Thank you. Bhavani?
I think everyone said the key points. Look, a robust resolution, critical, a strong OHCHR presence, member states taking very specific steps. I personally think the High Commissioner's report is excellent in terms of the recommendations. That's key. It's a good starting point. There are many others that have been looked at. I would say universal jurisdiction, all of that. The pressure points are key. But I keep coming back to Sri Lanka. Within Sri Lanka, what is it that we can build towards? What do we do after the session is over? And in that, I mean, there's been a lot of worrying things we've discussed, but I think there's also, I want to end on a positive note in terms of the resilience of the Sri Lankans, the resilience we have seen for decades. And even despite the darkest days, there's been things that we have been able to get through. So I think my colleagues, most of the colleagues here have been very active on the ground. And I think we need to look at those opportunities. So in that, the conversation needs to be, yes, Geneva is important. We all, I think, want Geneva to continue as a pressure point. But in the long term, in terms of the systematic structural issues, in terms of the racism, in terms of the militarization and the impunity, it's us that we need to do the work here. So I think in that we need the support from the international community, those in the panel, but also those listening, in terms of reaching out and helping us in the next phase, which is dark, which is difficult, which is possibly impossible, sometimes impossible, but I feel, maybe I'm the naive optimist, but I think there are things we need to start building right now. And I would like to end that.
Thank you, Bhavani. Pablo?
Thank you very much. Really, everyone's intervention includes things that I agree with emphatically, so there's little to say. I just want to reiterate, like many countries that have known conflict, one of the sad things about this is that it leaves in its wake a great deal of mistrust and the inability to coordinate and the inability to plan strategically. So I want to echo Bhavani's emphasis on the importance of this sort of internal coordination. However, also with Stephen and with Shreen, who has mentioned the resolutions emphasizing the preventive role of the Council and of other UN institutions. I also want to say the international community has its own problems thinking strategically and coordinating its support for Sri Lanka. And both levels of strategic thinking and coordination are necessary now, the national and the international.
Thank you, Pablo. And finally, Charles?
I guess I just want to pick up what Bhavani said, which is that we from the outside need to honor and understand that that there are dynamics in Sri Lanka. There are people in Sri Lanka that are dealing every day with what they have to, what they're subjected to, and they're finding ways to well, more than survive. They're finding ways to deal with life. And what we need to do is to get the UN to become a total partner in this. And what I'd like to say is that the UN has learned lessons. I think, however much, you know, that in a sense you can say that the UN can no longer justify by saying we don't have the structures to do it. They've learned the lessons. They've understood the commitment. What they lack right now is the courage. There's some very good people in the system. There are very good people in Colombo and elsewhere who really want to do the right thing, but the institution lacks courage. And that's why my advice to the Sri Lankan people is don't count on the UN, because you may be disappointed. While if you don't count on the UN and you count on your own resilience, and the UN actually turns out to perform, that will be such an unexpected win. So for me, don't build a strategy on the UN performing, but those of us who are on the outside see absolutely no justification for the UN not performing.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to all of the speakers for those closing remarks and for being extremely generous with your time. We are 20 minutes over, so I'm going to wrap it up very quickly. Thanks again to the audience, to everyone who's joined us from all around the world, for your attention, for your questions, and for your engagement with the subject. We hope that will continue. And thank you to our co-hosts, the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU, Global Tamil Forum, and Canadian Tamil Congress. So that's everything for today. Thank you all, and best wishes with all of your work in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.